I am excited to introduce you to our next speaker, valuing the CalFlexHub pipeline. So we're going to be talking about the cost effectiveness and the grid impacts of these technologies. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Sarah Smith. So I've been working with Sarah for maybe a decade. We started the demand response potential study. She worked on all 4 phases, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, where we first developed the shape, shift, shed, and shimmy concepts: shaping load, shifting load. Shimmy is fast acting, and shedding, we know that is. And Sarah is also about to publish the next update for the US estimate of how much data centers use in the United States. She is the first author on the 2025 update. So she's also spent a decade looking at data center energy. So she actually started as a postdoc working on these topics that are very important today. So Sarah, please. You can use that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Data centers and load flex are not bad business to be in right now. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here today. Thanks, Marianne and Jingjing and Kula and everyone for having me. I'm here to talk about the analysis arm of what we've been doing in CalFlexHub, looking at the potential of these technologies and thinking about kind of longer in the future, big picture, what could the widespread impacts be if we were able to roll these out. So if we go to this slide, we define the different technologies that are being looked at in the hub based on the customer base they're applicable to, what we understand the cost to be. And of course, a lot of these technologies are pretty early stage. So we try to think, a little more ahead of maybe not what it takes to put it in today, but what it could cost when it's rolled out, or for the products that are commercially available. We look at the present day costs and then how these technologies perform. We then have a set of baseline load shapes for the state of California that comes from the CPUC work Marianne was mentioning. And it's a model for all of the IOU territories of the whole state. And it's grouped into these customer clusters. So we can model, homes in different locations, different sizes and types of commercial and industrial facilities, and so on, and apply these technologies to these loads with a given price signal. And that's how we think about understanding how these technologies will impact the loads, and then what the benefits of that will be. So the next slide gives you a sense of what we've done in our most recent round of analysis. So we've done 3 kind of analysis cycles throughout the life of CalFlexHub. And if you've been to previous symposiums, you've heard me talk about this before. So most recently, we updated our analysis to cover these 6 technologies, and we've sort of taken a more generic approach. So not tying it explicitly to one brand of one product of a technology that's being tested in the hub, but thinking more broadly, what can residential pool pumps do? What can EV charging do? But you can see, the connections to some of if you're familiar with the cryptic CalFlexHub technology codes, then you can see some of the connections here. We've also, continued to update our assumptions for the costs and the performance of these technologies. And we have scenarios trying to capture the uncertainty in all these areas. There's just infinite uncertainty, it feels like. And we were also able to adopt some new price profiles, new since our previous rounds of CalFlexHub analysis. So these price profiles come from our dynamic pricing line of work with the CPUC. The most recent report on that just got published a couple weeks ago. I'll talk about that a bit at the end of this deck. But through that study, we worked with the PUC to forecast electricity costs to 2030. And then we use the CalFuse concept of a wholly volumetric retail dynamic price to model what that price curve might look like based on the system needs. The next slide gets into a little more granular in the methodology. I've covered most of this. I've covered most of the left. And so just coming over to the right, what we try to do with this analysis. And I should note, we work with Guidehouse and E3, our collaborators on this task. So we use some of their tools to set these assumptions, to do the modeling, and then to estimate the impacts to the grid. So what are the monetary grid benefits? What's the peak reduction in the critical hours on the grid? And then we look at the customer impacts. What are the bill savings? And with our assumptions for what it costs to enable the flexibility, what's that net cost benefit and potentially payback period for those technology costs? So next we have kind of one of the biggest, it's not quite an elephant in the room, we're all talking about it, but the uncertainty in prices. And this figure kind of gives you a glimpse of all the different ways you might think about what these prices might look like, and some of the different ways we've modeled them in our work. So the first thing I want to point out, so here you have the red and yellow are price profiles that LBL has modeled as hypothetical based on our understanding of the grid and the data we have on the loads in the state and the CPUC CalFuse framework. So again, that's a fully volumetric retail price. That is very different than the ACC, so the avoided cost calculator cost value stream, and the prices in blue, which is what we've pulled from PG&E's recent pilot. Those are marginal price profiles. So on a customer's bill, those prices would be paired with some other way of recovering non-marginal costs, whether that's a subscription, whether that's fixed charges, demand charges, whatever kind of makes up the rest of that bill. So that's why you see kind of the big difference on the y-axis. But you can also see the shapes of these are very different. And this also has to do just with choices around how these prices are designed. Our new study with CPUC, which presents that red line, that's actually a moderate version of the prices we forecasted, where only half of the grid costs are allocated dynamically. The other half are kept constant. And this is what we're understanding is kind of the most aggressive approach you might see based on the reality of, what it costs to run the grid and the fact that not all costs, so there's so many costs on the grid that are fixed. In that study, we also have a more mild version of that and a more aggressive kind of fully dynamic version. So the other thing I want to point out while I have this slide up is just kind of a little bit more of an existential question, is the value of load flexibility is completely dependent on what the grid needs. And so even if we all agreed on how exactly these prices would be, what categories would be included, how those equations would be set, as the grid evolves, as new loads come on, as new batteries get built, that is going to inherently change how much flexibility we need from customers. And so there's just an inherent uncertainty here in what these prices are going to look like. Like, for example, these PG&E prices are from 2025. It was very cold last year. If you were in the Bay Area, all summer it was very cold. We didn't have major grid stress events, at least that I'm aware of. And so, you don't see that steep of prices, but in that same exact pilot, same methodology of making those prices could have very different results, in a different situation. So as we do this analysis, we really try to capture how that uncertainty impacts, of course, the bill savings and the customer benefits from this. But I think it's especially important to think about if customers are, if the flexibility is going to require some sort of upfront investment from the customers, we need to really think about how we can give customers some guarantees of a certain amount of bill savings or a certain, foresight of what these price shapes might look like. Okay, so next, moving from the prices and all of the uncertainty there, we can think about how these technologies perform. So if you were in the sessions this morning, the charts that Jingjing and Marco were showing, you see those ranges of how much load was shed at a given site that was, they did the test on a given day. And those were just for, within the scope of what was tested for this project. If you kind of blow that out to all the customers on all the different sites, there's immense uncertainty in how these technologies will perform. We really characterize performance as 3 metrics. There's the round trip efficiency, which I think is the most straightforward. If you're just changing what time you charge your EV, you're changing what time you do your pool pump, you don't have losses there. Whereas the thermal storage or technologies that involve thermal shifting, there's some loss factor. And then we have the depth of the shed that we characterize as a percentage of the load that could be reduced during the window of time that you're trying to reduce it. And then the shift window in hours, which we think of as the entire window of a shift event, which is half increasing or taking the load and then half shedding the load. So this is what we found early on in CalFlexHub. We did some sensitivity analyses on these parameters, and we found that the shift window was the biggest driver of how valuable technology was. And so that was where we focused on kind of varying across these scenarios. And the reason the shift window is so important is if you think about the price profiles, they're, smooth slopes to some extent, and there's only so much differential you're going to get within a narrow window. So for example, a smart thermostat technology, as it was actually noted earlier this morning that, pre-cooling maybe isn't always that effective. There's not a lot of window there to move that load around. So you have a narrow window and there's only so much price differential you can get on that curve. Whereas something like EV charging, pool pump, water heating, something with storage, you're going to be able to really capitalize on the shape of that daily price signal. So I'll highlight in some of our results. Some of my results will just show this upper performance scenario, but I'll try to note how that varied here. And wherever we could, you don't need to go back today, but wherever we could, we tried to inform those parameters based on the great work that all of our CalFlexHub teammates are doing. So here's some of our results, thinking first about what can these technologies do, again, on mass scale in terms of flexing load. So on the left side, you have a kind of a verbose metric, but trying to be, very clear here. This is basically a peak reduction metric, but it's weighted by hours in the avoided cost calculator where generation costs were highest. So basically, in the hours in which that resource was expected to be constrained and that the price signal was sent accordingly, how much load was reduced in those hours. So if you add all of these up and you don't double count for technologies that cover the same end uses, this is where you get the 2.3 gigawatts of load reduction that Marianne mentioned this morning. That's for the medium performance scenario. And then with the upper performance scenario, you actually get up to 4.5 gigawatts of resource. And this is from technologies doing kind of day-to-day price response, the way we've modeled them. So we think, this is a very substantial resource, but again, this is kind of universal uptake of the technology. So scale that down by what percent of customers you think it might be feasible to get to do this. And then here we have the monetary value of the resources on the grid. Something, if you've somehow remember my presentations from prior symposiums, something that's very different this time around is that this generation capacity value, the yellow, is much smaller. In past versions of this analysis, that value really made up, 60, 70% of the value stream to the grid. But what we learned from our colleagues at E3 who are familiar with the avoided cost calculator is that the grid has seen a lot of build out of, we have capacity, we've built out a lot of grid scale storage, and actually a lot of the investments that are being made currently on the grid are to help meet the RPS goals. And so investments in grid capacity in California, those costs also show up in that GHG, some of those GHG categories as well. And so again, going back to kind of my soapbox on the prices, as the grid evolves, maybe we have a big spike in demand from data centers, maybe we, retire certain power plants. that is going to completely change the value of load flexibility. And so the more we can kind of foresee the evolution of the grid and have load flexibility sort of co-evolve with that, the more we can prevent, over-investing in capital on the grid, which then, kind of means you don't need the flexibility anymore. We want to get ahead of those investments and save money and lower costs that way. All right, so the next slide gets into, on the customer side, the bill impacts of the price response. So here you have, for each technology, there's 2 box plots that are 2 different price scenarios we used in this analysis. So that new 2030 kind of CalFuse inspired curve is what we call the dynamic price here. And then sending customers the avoided cost calculator, avoided cost stream directly is that ACC rate. So you can also see these box plots can be quite wide. There's a lot of variation in bill savings across customer groups. And some of this is we kind of have to make assumptions about what that spread might be, because the load shapes we're operating off of are aggregate or load shapes for customer clusters. And we don't have individual profiles of single water heaters and, single pool pumps. And we can't say exactly what you or your neighbor's pool pump will do and how much you will save versus your neighbor. So we have some sort of assumed distribution and variation across customers that's captured here. You can see for the most part, technologies tend to perform or to have more bill savings under that dynamic price profile. That price profile gives benefits sort of year round, especially in the shoulder season when there are ramps on the grid. Even if the capacity isn't peaking, our price shape still has that price differential. So you see like EVs and pool pumps have a big difference in the value, whereas on the commercial, the large cooling technologies, they perform better on the ACC rate, which has high prices, more concentrated in the summer hours. So shifting these really large cooling loads kind of has that bigger impact under that price. And then, I do need to note that this is the upper performance scenario. Looking at that medium performance scenario where we shorten the windows over which these loads can be moved, in some cases you see very significant reductions of up to 70 or 75% in the bill savings. So that's especially on the cooling technologies, where I think I'd have to go back and remind myself on the slide, but I think our window went from like 6 hours to 4 hours. So either 3 hours of shedding and 3 of pre-cooling, or 2 hours and 2 hours. And that difference can really substantially change the savings that customers would see, because again, they can't capitalize on as wide of price spreads. So then we can get into what it actually costs, or what we've modeled as it costing to enable these technologies. There is a lot of kind of layers to this, and a lot of ways we tried to capture the uncertainty here. So at a high level, you can think about costs as being, upfront hardware installation, and then software kind of installation and setup, and then ongoing sort of service charges. We haven't figured out the best word for this, but basically saying, is your, device manufacturer or your third party going to charge the customer a monthly fee to enable 24/7 price response? And that sort of ongoing maintenance or service cost is going to depend on which business models kind of come out in all of this. It's also going to depend on, who's getting the value from this load flex. If all the value is going to the customer and not to the third party, then the third party would ostensibly need to, charge a fee to the customer to recover some of that. Whereas if the value is shared amongst the different parties, then, that changes the math a bit. So we have we also separated customers. We tried to account for the fact that a lot of these devices are already out there, that they might not have that hourly price responsive feature, but they have the communications and they have the controls capability to do this. So most EV chargers, you can set the times you want to charge. thermostats. A lot of people have smart thermostats and so on. So that's kind of what's represented by these two panels here. And I did want to note, in case anyone was thrown off by this, on the heat pump water heaters, we basically just only focused our analysis on the heat pump water heaters that have the CTA 2045 ports, and anyone else who doesn't have that, we just excluded from the analysis, basically saying you're not going to go install an entirely new water heater to do this load flex. So in that regard, these water heaters already have the capability to do this communication. Okay, and then I'll also note on the commercial, the costs we have entered as they scale with the size of the building. So if you heard Marco's talk this morning, he talked a lot about how difficult and how customized a lot of these systems are, especially for larger buildings. And so the upfront kind of commissioning and design of those control systems, we think, scales with size and can get to be quite high for large facilities. So when we combine, on the next slide, we'll have kind of when you net out the costs with the bill savings, and this is like an annual annuity, what's the net benefit to the customers? So you can see that for the most part, we're in the black here. Things are above zero. If you have the connectable device, it's all upside, really. You're saving money on your bill. So that really mirrors the bill savings figure I showed before, for the most part. And then if you don't have the device, there's some costs that go into that. But we still see decent savings until you get to large buildings that don't have automation systems and kind of baseline control systems. Then it can be, so the upfront cost of commissioning that can be so high that the bill savings can eat into that quite a bit. This figure does not have the sort of service fees I was mentioning before. So if we click one more slide, we have sort of I don't know, it doesn't show up too well. It is a red line, but these dashed lines that kind of illustrate if you had something like a $10 a month service charge, how much of your annual benefit would that eat into? So that would kind of chop off that, because it's a life cycle annuity. So there's some discounting. It would chop off that, $100 or so. And you do see some of like the water heating technologies, the thermostat, depending on the price signal, you see a lot of that value could be eaten up by a service charge like that. So again, it's going to be important to think about what are the business models? How do these features for price responsiveness come to be? Is it something that every vehicle charger is going to have, every thermostat's going to have, as just an option that's, maybe the OEMs are just offering that as a way to sell their products and the customers have to pay for that. That's going to be a very different situation than a customer having to either pay extra for that service or have a lot of the value in the bill savings going to a third party to offer that service. I think I just have a couple more slides. So when we think about the cost versus benefits in terms of a payback period, we have these results that Marianne showed earlier, although we had one update to our analysis that changed one of them. But for the most part, you might have seen this morning. And I want to note here that the ranges shown here are for the different population averages in our different scenarios. So the population-wide payback period, there's a much wider range here, but this is just capturing that uncertainty from different price profiles, different performance levels, and then between the blue and the gold, you see the difference in what you're assuming the customers are having to pay upfront to enable the technologies. So again, you see what kind of, if you already have the smart thermostat or the smart charger, again, you're saving money from day one. The payback period is very low. But then even for the large building technologies that do have those more expensive upfront costs, have those higher payback periods, again, depending on the performance and price scenario, you might still have population averages that are, in the 3 to 6 year range. So within that population, you are going to still have a lot of candidates with low payback periods here. So yeah, in conclusion, so a lot of words on here. We see a lot of value in these technologies. We see a lot of potential. We see the kind of evolution of the technology ecosystem pushing us along in terms of connectable devices that are already out there and features that, customers already want. With those devices, that gives us a lot of momentum to enable these end uses to provide value, but they need the price responsive functionality to do so. And then, as I've said 50 times already, massive uncertainty, both in the price shapes and the performance of the technologies that does leave a lot of questions of how things actually net out in terms of, annual bill savings for customers. And that ties into, what Sarah was talking about this morning of what's going to motivate customers. If I say you're going to save $14 a year, maybe that's still a net savings for you, but that might not be enough to motivate it. So understanding, how these bill savings compare to people's baseline bills. Is it a meaningful fraction of their electricity costs? And B, is it enough to really, even if it pencils out on paper, does it motivate that getting involved in this is I think, something we need to continue exploring. We did find a couple of technologies, EV charging, pool pumps, that seem pretty good to go in terms of their ability to provide value in any, under all the kind of uncertainty scenarios. And we, want to definitely continue exploring both how these price shapes are evolving, how the grid value streams are evolving, and how the technology costs are developing. So with that, I just have one more slide that's a bit of a plug. So the new the new price response potential study that was supported by the California Public Utilities Commission is available now at the LBL site. Here are these different price designs I mentioned we explored. We also did 2 different scenarios of different cost trajectories of just how much rates are going up in general. So we have this low and high and 3 different design scenarios for the tariffs. And then you can see in the legend here the scope of what we modeled for this study. And we built kind of different models for this study than what we were using in the CalFlexHub analysis. So there's some different logic there of kind of speculating on when a given end use gets that hourly price signal, what do they then do with that? And how do they think about their response? So, and we have ag crop irrigation included here as well. So, again, we found, similar high level takeaways, a lot of technical potential, a lot of economic potential, particularly considering connectable devices as adopted today and kind of with the inertia we have there. But big questions around customer bill savings and customer motivations to participate. Yeah.